The point of these discussions is not to interrogate these views at any length as we've done in the past. We're going to look at them, we're going to look at some concerns, we're going to move on. And so now we're going to move on to a totally different way to think about matters of economic justice. And this is advanced by the philosopher John Rawls. John Rawls, in his book Theory of Justice, gave us a different conception of the demands of justice when it comes to the distribution of economic resources. To get there, though, it's really worth spending a moment thinking about the frame that Rawls gives us to imagine how we would arrive at the conclusions of what justice demands. For Nozick got there by thinking in a way similar to how Immanuel Kant thought, that we have these, there are these constraints, these rights that we all have, and they can't be violated. For Rawls though thought more in a contractualist sense, also somewhat Kantian, but we're going to leave that aside. Rawls wanted us to collectively agree on what the demands of justice are. Question, though, is, well, how do we collectively agree on this? This sounds like the sort of thing that we would all disagree with. And Rawls thought, well, not necessarily. We all can agree from the start, says Rawls, that justice is fairness. That when we're thinking about what justice demands, we really should hear that as what is fair. And so long as you're on board with that, and that is controversial, I might add, there is some controversy behind that, but so long as you're on board with the idea that for a state to be just, it should be fair, then we can imagine a thought experiment guaranteed, says Rawls, to give us conclusions that are fair. And so he introduces this thought experiment of reasoning behind a veil of ignorance. The thought is supposed to be this. We all come together and we walk into an imaginative room. And as we pass through this room, we pass through a veil that robs us of certain crucial knowledge about ourselves. Right? We no longer know our age. We no longer know our sex, our gender, our race, our creed. We know that we're human beings. We don't know how intelligent we are. We don't know how athletic we are, or how beautiful we are. We don't know these things, right? And and all of us come together under this veil of ignorance. We've been robbed of this knowledge. But we've been robbed of this knowledge so that we can think fairly, so that our own biases don't inform our thinking. And now in this original position, right, behind the veil of ignorance, we're supposed to ask ourselves, what kind of a society would we collectively agree to live in once we leave? Once we leave the original position, once we remove the veil of ignorance, what would we agree to live in? What kind of society? And so Rawls invites us at this point to think in a totally self-interested sense. So at this point, I'm supposed to think just about what would be rational for me to agree to while not knowing certain things about me. For behind a veil of ignorance in this original position, Rawls suggests that the first thing we would all agree to before anything else is we'd want the society that we ended up living in to be one in which all of our basic liberties were guaranteed. We would want a society in which we could speak freely, worship freely, assemble freely, we could all vote, we could all run for office, etc., etc. And the thought behind that is it would be irrational not to want that. I don't know what faith I'm going to have when I get into this society, so I'm going to want a society that lets me to practice any faith that I want. I don't know what gender I'm going to be. I don't know what my sex is going to be. I don't know any of these things. So I'm going to want a society that maximizes the ability for me to live the life that I want to live, regardless of how I end up. So that's the first thing that we would guarantee. Then the second thing that we would guarantee, that's the first principle of justice. The second principle of justice has these two parts. The first part is we would want guaranteed a society in which, from a vocational standpoint, there was fair equality of opportunity. We would want not just equal opportunity in the sense that every door was open to us, but fair equality of opportunity, that we all competed based on merit, based on our own skills and strengths, and nothing else. Fair equality of opportunity is an interesting idea. One way to wrap your head around it is to think along the following lines. Is a society really meeting demands of fairness by just making it be the case that anyone can apply for a job if it's failing miserably in having two people who are equally skilled at something or have the equal set of talents be in an equal position to compete for that job? The thought is, if we are failing in terms of education or something like that, we might end up with two individuals, both of whom are just as smart, but only one of whom is really in a position to succeed at that job because the other person hasn't been given the educational resources that she needs in order to succeed. So to really have fair equality of opportunity, we not only need to have the door open for everyone, but we also need it to be the case that, that it's advantages and disadvantages in terms of talents and skills that are deciding these things, and not advantages and disadvantages that one bears due to where you were born or social conditions. Again, the idea behind this is supposed to be that from behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, I'm going to want it to be the case that if I'm applying for a job, if I'm pursuing a vocation, I want the likelihood of me getting that job or not to be based on my skills and my talents, not on social circumstances outside of my control. That's why all of us, says Rawls, would agree to fair equality of opportunity from behind the veil of ignorance. Okay, so we're collectively reasoning together. We decide that we want a society that secures all these basic liberties, political liberties, liberties in terms of speech and religious practice and so forth. We agree that we want fair equality of opportunity. Now what do we think about the distribution of income and wealth? What would we agree to? And here's probably Rawls' most controversial claim. He says that, well, from behind a veil of ignorance, we would agree to a distribution of income and wealth based on what he calls the difference principle. Namely, that if there was any difference in income and wealth between individuals, if there is any inequality that we might see, if one person has more than someone else, we would allow that in society so long as we could say that that arrangement of economic goods, that arrangement of income and wealth, was the best arrangement for the worst off members of society. In other words, it's the arrangement that does the most good for the least well-off members of society. If that can't be truly said, if another arrangement would lift individuals even further up, then that's the arrangement that we would have to go on. So the thought, according to the difference principle, is that inequalities in income and wealth are justified only if they can be, it can be told to the least advantaged members of society that we're doing as good as we possibly could be doing to them. Now, there's some technical apparatus behind that idea that we're absolutely not going to pursue in this module. I simply want to point to what this is not saying. What this view is not saying is that, hey, here's one distribution of income and wealth, and the worst off members of society are doing like so-so with it. And here's another distribution of income and wealth, and the worst off members of society are doing better according to the second one. And let's say that right now we're in the second one. We might go, oh, that satisfies Rawls's principle. No, it has to be the case that there's not a third distribution of income and wealth that's even better for the worst off members of society. It's not enough to simply have a distribution of income and wealth that makes the worst off better than they otherwise would have been. It's got to put them in the best position possible. So Rawls does allow for inequality in income and wealth, but only if we could plausibly say to the least advantaged members of society, you could not be made better off in terms of income and wealth from any other social arrangement, social, political, economic arrangements that we could come up with. This is as best as we could do. Rawls thinks that we would all agree to this from behind a veil of ignorance because we don't know what kind of a society we're going into. And by that I mean we don't know what we're going to be like in that society. We don't know whether the talents and the skills that we have are going to be the talents and the skills that that society needs, and so we're going to end up having a wide range of vocations open to us, or whether the talent and skill set that we have is just not that interesting in the society given historical circumstances or whatever, and so we're not going to have a lot of vocations open to us. We don't know, in other words, where we're going to fall on this. And so as a matter of self-interest, we would want to maximize the likelihood that we would want to maximize the worst off position because we ourselves might occupy that position. For those of you who think along these terms, you'll recognize that this is a risk-averse strategy, and the claim is that it's rational to be risk-averse in this sense, and some people might disagree with that, and there is a monumental literature behind whether the original position gives us the difference principle. We're not going to look into that now. What we do get, though, is that from behind a veil of ignorance, there are two fundamental principles of justice that we would arrive at. We would secure basic liberties. We would make sure then that, and here's the two parts of the second principle, that we would have fair equality of opportunity and that economic resources would be distributed according to the difference principle. distributing economic resources that way is a lot different than what you get with no-zig or hard libertarianism. The state would play a pretty radical role in intervening and making sure that there was an equitable distribution. And you can imagine looking at any society that currently exists in the world, none of these societies satisfy the difference principle. So this theory of justice would warrant more aggressive intervention by the state, which is one reason why some people have no interest in being Rawlsians when it comes to this, and other people are, of course, all on board. Rawls has come under criticism from both the left and the right. You can imagine what the criticism from the right is. It's roughly of the form, this idea of Rawls, the kind of state that Rawls justifies in his theory of justice, is has much too much power, much too much coercive control over the fruits of our own labors. The other side of it, though, is actually a Marxist critique. It's a critique from the left, and it criticizes Rawls in not going far enough. It says that Rawls thinks that that we need a difference principle to justify inequality in income and wealth, and it really looks at that view and says, well, why, Rawls, do you think that we should allow any difference in income and wealth? When you unpack Rawls a little bit more, you get the idea that for Rawls, he thinks that we actually could have a better society if people were more motivated to behave a certain way based on getting more economic resources. This is not a new idea to a lot of people, but a Marxist will say, well, sure, if you're brainwashed to think like a capitalist already, you're going to think that you need to motivate people by gaining more money in order to really inspire them to do certain things. But we ought to abandon the idea that humans are naturally greedy and can only be incentivized by getting more economic resources in terms of the job that they pursue. That is another debate that we're not going to look at here. There's a tremendous amount of literature on Marxist critiques of Rawls and, of course, of libertarianism. Really, I just wanted to show you these two big views, libertarianism versus liberal egalitarianism, Nozick versus Rawls. Nozick was in the Harvard philosophy department, so was Rawls. These two were friends. They just had fundamental disagreements about what justice demanded. And I think that that's a good enough introduction to this area for us to step back and say, all right, great. What in the world does any of that have to do with superheroes? I mean, how do superheroes promote economic justice? Now, we already saw that Superman, for instance, would intervene early in comic books and help the downtrodden. But besides moments of intervention like that, what are we supposed to do with this? If Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way, and part of the justice that Superman is supposed to be pursuing is economic justice, what can Superman do? It's not like Superman can pass policy on his own. At least he can't do that if he wants to respect democracies. And so I think this is a really interesting question, because we're so used to superheroes typically being given adversaries that they can beat eventually, even if they can't figure out the way to fight them at first. Usually, let's just be honest, usually most of the time, the Justice League or Superman, I'm not mentioning Marvel right now, but we could pick on Marvel as well, they fight adversaries that they can beat, and typically they can beat by punching them in the face eventually, or something like that. Promoting economic justice doesn't work that way. But I don't think that we should ignore the fact that if you really do want to influence policy, if you really do want to change the way that people think about economic matters, your role in society to influence policy, to nudge people towards having a different imagination about what justice demands, can just be as a superhero. We can imagine Superman fighting for economic justice, if he's a Rawlsian, say, by making demands of Congress to take the view seriously, by campaigning with certain senators or members of the House who endorse a more liberal egalitarian view, putting his brand, in other words, behind the idea of a more equitable distribution of resources. Or we could imagine Superman becoming a hard libertarian. I'm not going to get into where you think Superman should fall down. The point is, someone like Superman or the Justice League can use the brand that they stand for, justice itself, to try to persuade the public. That's not going to be as engaging a superhero story. You know, you're not going to be flipping over the pages as they do this, but it is what superheroes can do. And we have seen some stories over the years of superheroes trying to endorse these sorts of ideas in this more passive way. They'll support it not directly by threatening people who don't endorse their particular views of economic justice, but they will nonetheless put their name and their brand behind certain positions. And so maybe we should ask that of superheroes more and more, both within countries and globally.